basically relating him to important historical events. And then, as you'll find out later on, I learned that pretty much everything I knew about him was wrong. I thought I knew about him was wrong. So the methods was that I interviewed my family members. They were pretty intimate discussions that usually ran really long, like 2 hours each. Have them share their stories about their lives and how they interweave with that of their grandfather. So I thought this was really important because a lot of my interviews were like, oh, but this doesn't have anything to do with my grandfather, but I just really wanted to know. And you'll see that with my themes. I also transcribed and translated all the interviews, which is kind of tedious, but especially in the translation part, we'll see how that sometimes causes problems. I extracted stories from them, and I just typed them up, so basically made like a cleaner version of each story. I wrote them and I published them on the blog called Memorias.com, and it's still up. And I'm gonna obviously, and I also wrote an article on the Scripps Voice, which you guys are see that. It's gonna have different parts that I don't mention in this presentation, so just to not be redundant. I also got all of my family photos from like different places. I went to people's houses and found all the photos and then digitized them. So it took me like 3 days, but I scanned them all. So now I have them in my flash drive. And I also got all the things that were in random computers and phones, and I printed them. So yeah, so sometimes like, very old cell phones, and it's because I think that's one of the parts that sometimes doesn't happen. I think my computers crash, phones get lost, and I really wanted to make sure that I have physical copies of the digital things, and then digital copies of everything. And then also, not next week, but next week on October, I don't know the date now, because we changed the date, but I'm going to do an educational component that's going to be with Café con Leche. So, and it's going to be in SCORE Thursday at 10 p.m. It's going to be next Thursday.
October what? October 3rd.
October 3rd. We're going to have a workshop. And if you are interested to be there, this is more going to be like an interactive workshop. And also, I can talk about this forever because they're just stories. So instead, I decided I'm going to talk about 4 themes. The 4 themes that I've compiled, and I think that should cover like a broad array of what I've learned, is that the first theme is a person undergoes a complete transformation over their lifetime. Everybody has their story, and it's invaluable to know about your ancestors, even those you've never met, and also that even social movements that fail are important to document. So how do you get from him to him? The thing is, like, this picture, I wouldn't have even known it was my grandfather. It's probably like the oldest picture we have of him, and the cool part is that I actually, like, later on will receive some from Mexico, because there's an annual festival called Dia San Alejo that praises like the San Alejo, and they have a lot of pictures. But these are the ones we have in the United States, and this is the most recent one. Well, this is very recent. It's from November 2012, so it's pretty much on his birthday. And so, pretty much the grandfather that I knew all my life, because he was the one who raised me, is not the grandfather that I used to be. And so, just the fact that there's so many things that I didn't know about his character and personality. Like, for instance, with his sons, he was very strict. He would be like, he would like have like a trash can and then like whip the trash can to scare them off. Like, he would have like a leather whip. But with me, he was extremely soft and gentle. And I was like, what? That can't be right, And same thing, like I learned that my grandfather had a problem with alcoholism. It's like for like at least the first 40 years of his life, and that's not the grandfather I knew. I didn't know a grandfather that had problems with alcoholism or smoking or anything like that. He was always just, very sober and clean. And the way he treated my grandmother, which was not very well, they didn't have a good relationship with, is not the same way he treated Santovia, which we'll talk about, Gregoria, which we'll talk about later. The relationship between them was completely different. So just the fact that, like, your personality, like, sometimes they're able to recognize people sometimes. And then cool is that everyone has a story, and I think the more I learn about my grandfather, the more I want to learn about everyone else. I wanted, for instance, like, I talked to my aunt, Celia, and I asked her, like, was like, oh, well, I'm just a net, so I'm not going to know that much. But I asked her, like, why did you cross Mexico to come to the United States? And she said, oh, because I wanted to take care of you. And that just, like, that was really powerful. Because I know it's true. But just knowing, like, why do people cross? Why do people come here? I asked everyone in my family, like, why did you cross? Or what happened? How was the crossing to Mexico to here? Same thing with my mother. I think the interview with my mother was really long. It was, like, hours and hours. She's like, are you going to pay me for this? But the same thing, I learned so much about, like, her younger days, and I learned that about, like, for instance, I didn't know that when I was 4, like, we were about to go homeless. Like, how was I gonna know that? Carmen Ceballos is, like, the longtime partner of my grandfather for, like, about 40 years. So pretty much just when he came over here, apparently he didn't even tell her that he had a wife and kids back then. He came here and they've always, like, been together since 1990. They've had a house together. And so I got to learn more about her too, because since she wasn't my grandmother, like, I never had a personal connection with her. And, like, I think I would tell Kim, like, it's weird, like, how do I talk to her? But, like, she ended up being really cool and awesome, and, like, now I really admire her more than I ever do. So, also just, like, the learning about, like, our amazing ancestors, that even if I've never met them, and even though there's, for example, the first one is Memorias. So she's the first wife of my grandfather, and the thing is, since he had 2 wives, Gregoria and Enriqueta, and then Carmen, she's just like a partner. And with Gregoria Huerta, it was the first marriage and they had kids, but Enriqueta, which is my grandmother, never had a positive image of her. So I always thought of her, like, in not a very positive light. Like, my grandma would make fun of her name, because, who in Mexico is called Segovia, so she would, like, just never really give me a good image of her. She, the way she characterized her. But by learning about, like, talking to my uncles who was Gregoria's and mom, I learned way more about her, and I learned that she's way deeper than that. She was very wealthy. Like, she actually owned her own hacienda, so pretty much the livelihood depended on her. When her father died, she was the owner, and that was not very common at the time for a woman to own an hacienda. So she was obviously very, like, suited for, and she also taught my grandfather how to, like, handle bees, because she was a professional beekeeper, and how to do wax. So, but she died in 1967 through child labor. Because back in the day, like, people had 1 kid apiece every year. So she, she gave birth 16 times. Like, but, like, in a short lifetime, she gave birth 16 times. But another person I learned about was Sebastián Barrios, and he was a man of the Cristeros War in the Revolution, so, like, really way back. And he was the one who taught my grandfather how to forge iron. And my grandfather, he started a ironworking company, which we still maintain, called Herrera Bros. So we come from a family of iron workers, Herrera iron, if that's like a translation in Spanish. And so Sebastián Barrios was he didn't have any kind of education, just like my grandpa. My grandpa didn't know how to read or write, but he still learned how to forge iron, make guns for the revolutionaries, and he knew how to make bathtubs, kettles. So it was just fascinating to learn how people learn themselves even without formal try to like fight and get the money, especially for his daughter, you know, because they're still living in Mexico. But actually, in the end, they didn't give him the money, and now he's passed. And they did give a name, like if he was passed to give it to the daughter, but I mean, it probably won't even happen. They probably will never give the money. And so it seems interesting because you would think like since the movement failed, like does it deserve to be documented? And I believe that it is necessary to document it because it gives a necessary respect, right? You have to give respect to like the struggles that people have, and also because it gives a lesson to the future. The fact that people aren't quiet about this, and the fact that people are, and also because it gives lessons for the future. Because one of the errors my grandpa did was that he waited too long. Like he could have started doing this earlier, and but he went like in 2011 when the movement was already getting over and the government was already like resolving the issue, and so he did it a little too late. So it also provides lessons for the future if you document these things. And so this is a letter from my grandpa, and that's his testimony that he did in order to try to get the bracero money. So he testified that on these dates and on these places, Freckles, Texas, and Wyoming, he picked, you know, beets, and he picked cebolla and onions, and so, and as you can see, I think I want to put this picture because it just shows, first of all, the fact that, and I know my dad specifically told me to put this picture on the presentation, is because it shows, first of all, that he can write. Like he didn't have schooling at all. The teachers didn't start coming into his pueblo until he was 12. So by that time he was too old because he needed to work in the field. But he still self-taught how to write, and he taught himself how to, you know, read and write English once he came over here. So that just shows, and then like even the way he writes, I mean, you know, it looks a little odd but it's pretty much he actually was able to teach himself. I remember when he would be working, he would always carry a little notebook when he was like practicing writing. He would always carry that the whole time, with a little notebook when he would be writing. And so this morning, we had time for even the Q&A. I also have questions to consider. And then there's just my acknowledgements. Thank
you. So, any questions for Nancy?
So can you give examples of things that you found out that weren't true? Like even more examples? That's just so interesting. Like you thought something and then did people disagree? Is that where you found out like that there was a disagreement, or was there actually something where like some people were proved wrong?
Yeah, like another thing that I thought was I had told you that my grandpa had gotten the Reagan amnesty. But in reality he had gotten citizenship before that, and that's because he married a white woman. Like a blonde, like una güera. So she married like a blonde woman just with papers. You know, never saw them again. But the reason they had always told me it was the amnesty is because it's really shamed upon. Like they say it's one of his dark marks. So people don't want to talk about the fact that people married for papers. So that I had been told it was the amnesty because it was. I guess it's an easier answer to give, but in reality that's not how it was. And then the first event that was the Crusados War, and the same thing, I always felt like things, like I thought my grandpa had been baptized like really young, but like, and I mean it's just more like the historical data is really weird, so I think it probably did happen, which is the thing that my grandpa got baptized on the top of a hill because the Crusados War was happening, so priests were being persecuted, and it was very anti-religious movement. So he had to be baptized in secret. But it's just that the day he was born doesn't correlate with the official textbook's account of when the Crusados War started, which is like a whole year afterwards. But it definitely could have been that there were already uprisings happening in local places that I didn't know about.
Any other questions?
Not a question, more of a comment. It's just like amazing that you were saying about everyone has a story, and I've come across people that tell me like, no, it's not as important. Like, oh, it's just a little thing. Like it's not, but really it is. And sometimes we have this perception that if it's not documented, it's not legitimate. That stories aren't legitimate. But like you were saying,